Nico Iamaleava played so well in Tennessee football's opener that he's perhaps deserving of a new nickname, and John Adams gave him one in his column at KnoxNews.com, calling him Heismanaleava. Is that hyperbole or fitting after the performance from Tennessee's star quarterback in a blowout victory against Chattanooga and ahead of Tennessee's game against North Carolina State? Welcome into the Volunteer State. I'm Blake Toppmeyer alongside the Knoxville News Sentinel's Adam Sparks. Adam wanted to get into some conversation surrounding overreaction or fair assessment after this win over Chattanooga. Of course, it is a little bit hard to get a read on FCS results, but as good as you could look in an FCS game, Tennessee did. So let's start with Nico. And as I mentioned, John has dubbed him Heismanaleava. So Adam, is that pretty appropriate with what we've seen in early returns here from Nico?
Well, for starters, I have a hard time saying Heismanaleava, whatever you just said. when I read John's, I thought Iamaleava took me 6 months to get that one even close to right. I can't add another long word onto it. So John, you got to get a better one. I don't know what you could do with nicknames there, but
I did it on deadline, so I mean,
it's
give
fair.
me more
That's
time.
fair.
I might can get something better.
Although I will say in the press room, when that headline came across, immediately at least one or two of our competitors claimed that they had come up with the same thing but had not printed it yet. So, but as we know in history, the first one to publish it in ink is the one that owns it. So we own it. So here's the deal with Nico. Everybody saw his numbers, great numbers. I think for Tennessee fans, it's a different experience than it is for those far outside of the fan base of the beat or whatever. Those outside of it look at that and say, well, he's a 5-star guy. Looks like he put up a lot of big numbers. And you watch 3 highlights and say, yeah, that looks like a really good quarterback. I think for the Tennessee fan, it goes a lot deeper than that. And for a beat writer covering it, goes a lot deeper than that. Sitting up in the press box during that game, you get the wide view of the field. More so, you see a lot more early in the play than you do on TV or even other places in the stadium. The feeling when Joe Milton would throw the ball was sort of a cringe a little bit. I think he put too much on that. That's not going to drop in between where he thinks it's going to be. Occasionally, you would be like, wow, look. He just threw a 100-mile-per-hour fastball over 30-something yards. That's impressive. But on so many throws, you would think, oh, that's going to be over that guy's head. With Nico, you would see an open man. Again, you wouldn't see it on the TV broadcast initially, but you would see the wide field. You would see a receiver break open, and your immediate thought, at least after a couple throws by Nico, was he's going to hit that guy. That guy's open, he's going to hit him, or that guy's one-on-one, he's going to hit him. And he did 95% of the time the other day. There was a throw, it was on the first or second drive where Chris Brazel, the new wide receiver from Tulane, had a dig route, which is a 18, 20-yard route where he goes up the field and turns in. And he was running toward 3 defenders and sort of peeled off where he went a little deeper, kind of behind them. And if you pause that and you look at it, you say, well, he's not open. He's not even close to open. But when he peeled off, there was a little bit of space there. And Nico threw, if you count his drop back, he's throwing the ball about 28 yards in the air. And it had enough velocity to get there before a safety behind Brazel closed in on him. But it haven't had enough touch to get over those 3 defenders. It's an NFL throw. It's a touch throw. It's just this combination of velocity and touch that Nico has that Hendon Hooker had on certain routes, especially seam routes where he hit Jalen Hyatt on. Think back to the Alabama game. But Nico has that Joe didn't. And I think that was more the visceral experience of Tennessee fans that were in the stadium, maybe some at home, but certainly from the press box, you could watch plays and say, well, I think he's going to – there's a small space there, and I think he's going to hit it, and he always did.
John, and you pointed out in our SEC Football Unfiltered podcast how impressed you were with Nico working the middle of the field. You felt like that was a a big difference than what you saw from Tennessee's offense last season, right?
Yeah, well, it's because of the accuracy that Adam just mentioned. Tennessee doesn't has reservations about throwing over the middle. I think with a lot of quarterbacks, not just with Tennessee's, but in general, if you're not completely convinced your quarterback can thread the needle, that he can drop it in the right spot in a zone. You're worried about those safeties, worried about deflections, and my goodness, with Joe Milton's throws, I mean, he might bounce a ball off a helmet and ricochet over to a safety, so for an interception. But there was no hesitation with Nico. They let him throw over the middle to wide receivers, tight ends, whatever, and it really worked because of what Adam just said. The accuracy. Three things really stood out to me: accuracy, uh, speed of the ball. He could throw fastball if he needed to. He could change it up and have a really nice touch pass. But that laser-like release where he just got rid of the ball so quickly on the bubble screens that are so prominent in Heupel's offense, that throws out of the backfield to the running back, those receivers it's an easy ball to catch. He catches it, and they still got time to make a move before the defender comes up. And a lot of quarterbacks don't do that because the pass is not right just where it needs to be, or it's not there just on time. Then it ends up the defender's right there, and you might get a 3-yard gain. Tennessee's going to make some really big plays, I think, off those short passes because of Nico's quick release.
Well, and let me add on to that. One thing moving this forward in the NC State game this Saturday is I want to see where Nico's confidence level is in making those throws against a better defense, against better defenders, because it was clear to me in a number of those throws. Like if you go back and watch the film, the game, the TV copy or whatever, and you pause it when he's getting ready to throw, the receiver a lot of times does not look open when he's winding up to throw. Obviously, the receiver would be by the time the ball gets there. He had a lot of confidence. I wonder if that confidence translates in the same way when the safety runs a 4.6 40 and not a 4.8 40. You know what I mean? Because he could just be that good, and that would work against any defense. He also maybe could be overconfident because it was a lot easier against Chattanooga. He also could be confident depending on the opponent and know that I can do this against Chattanooga, but I can't do that against Georgia, so to speak. So I'll be interested to see this like week to week, how tight the window gets and how much he thinks he can fit it in there.
The final score was a blowout. Probably not much surprise there. We've seen Tennessee do that to overmatched opponents before in the Heupel era. But I'm curious what you guys thought about the defense. Tennessee just allows 3 points. Coming into the season, I think if there was a question about Tennessee, and there might have been a few, but I think maybe the biggest was, how's that defense going to be? Is it going to be like an 8-4, 9-3 type of defense, or is it going to be a playoff level defense, particularly in the secondary, with so many new faces in the defensive backfield? I know it's Chattanooga. I know it's FCS game. Maybe you weren't able to take much from it, but in so much as you were, did you walk away thinking anything new or different about the defense?
Well, there was a freak out over James Pierce barely playing. He played 10 snaps. 5 of them were passes. One of them he dropped into coverage. So that's 4 times he could rush. I think they cut blocked him 2 or 3 of those. So Tennessee let him get a few reps and then pulled him out of there. There's no reason that he should be on the field against the Chattanooga team, at least not for long. They want more pressure. A lot of what Chattanooga did was to neutralize pressure. There was a trade-off that Chattanooga made, which was they cut block and they got the ball out of their quarterback's hands really quickly, where they basically were saying, we're not going to take sacks, and the sacrifice that we're going to make is we may just complete a few balls for like 6 yards, and that's basically what they did, which Tennessee will take that against any other opponent. Any concerns that I had at the secondary before this game are exactly the same after this game. We talked to Willie Martinez today, the day that we're we're recording this, and the secondary coach, Willie Martinez, had some compliments for Boo Carter, the freshman star position nickelback. He complimented two of the corners, Jermod McCoy and Jalen McMurray. Those are the transfers. Ricky Gibson, by the way, the other corner, was out with a minor injury in the last game. He'll play against NC State. He did not. He wasn't asked specifically about any of the safeties, but he also didn't volunteer anything positive about the safeties. The one thing he did say about the secondary was the alignments were not great. They need to be better in alignments, sort of their assignments, and they need to be much better in communication. And that's usually the safeties when you're talking about issues in communication. So my takeaway from that was, safeties didn't play very well against a bad team. They got to be better. I look at Pro Football Focus grades some. It's not scripture or anything, but I do look at it for sort of a general idea about how they graded. And Will Brooks didn't grade terribly well in coverage. He's the walk-on safety who is starting. Andre Turrentine had a terrible grade at least one of his categories. I forget which one. And the new transfer, Jacoby Thomas from MTSU, he had actually had a reasonably good grade. I'll be curious to see if he gets more reps or starts. But, if you only had like a so-so grade against Chattanooga, I don't feel any better about the safeties specifically, but the secondary in general going into a game where they're going to face a quarterback who's thrown for 10,000 yards and like 90 touchdowns in his career in Grayson McCall.
I think it was virtually impossible to evaluate Tennessee's secondary and maybe even its linebacking core in that game, because those are questions you had coming into the season. So we just don't know. I mean, doesn't mean that the questions haven't been answered, that this isn't a better back end of the defense. But you can't say it is based on, as Adam pointed out, the scheme that Chattanooga used. It didn't really give Tennessee a chance to show how much better it was. So I think we go into the NC State game just as we went into the season, uncertain about this. And I think I was watching some of the Georgia-Clemson game. I watched most of it. I recorded the Georgia-Clemson game. And Georgia's defense, I guess you could say this about any defense under Kirby Smart, the way it's been, it just looked really fast to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I watched Alabama against Western Kentucky, again, an overmatched opponent, but I was conscious of the defensive speed. And this is kind of nebulous. I realize I wasn't as conscious of that watching Tennessee. And maybe that means nothing, but it's just, just from watching, that's what I came away with.
John, you were on the playoff side of the fence coming into the season for Tennessee. Adam and I were on the 9-3 side of the fence, and I don't know that one game against Chattanooga requires too much recalculation from that. But elsewhere around the SEC, there were some important results in Week 1 that I think hurt the conference as a whole, but may actually help Tennessee. Those results: LSU loses to Southern Cal, and Texas A&M lost to Notre Dame. Now, losing to Notre Dame probably doesn't help the SEC at all, because if Notre Dame makes the playoff, that could take a spot away from another SEC team. But as we look at this through a Tennessee lens, Tennessee's path to the playoff might be for the SEC to get 5 teams, and perhaps they could be that 5th team. And if we're crossing LSU and Texas A&M off the list after Week 1, I know they're not eliminated, but their resume took a hit with Week 1 losses. If we're kind of crossing them off the list for now, do you feel a little bit more bullish about Tennessee's playoff chances? John, I know you were already there in the preseason, or do we think this still sort of comes back to, the NC State and Oklahoma games in the coming weeks?
Well, I still think Tennessee is a playoff team, and I had Tennessee rated ahead of both LSU and Texas A&M. However, I didn't have Notre Dame in a scenario where the SEC puts 5 teams in the playoff. I don't have Notre Dame making it. I was counting on Notre Dame losing to Texas A&M and losing one other game. I thought that was a huge loss for the SEC that A&M lost. You can forget about it. I know you could say, well, A&M has a loss. If Tennessee were competing for a playoff bid with A&M, that wouldn't, that would be a problem. But no, A&M doesn't have a quarterback. And so you can forget about A&M. They're done. But Notre Dame has an accommodating schedule. It's won a tough game on the road, a very tough place to win. And it's still got USC at the end of the year. And I didn't see Southern Cal as a playoff team either, because I thought in the Big Ten, I didn't think it would make the top 3. I look at Southern Cal now and I say, that's a playoff team. So I came away from that weekend and from those games in particular, thinking that the SEC will only get 4 teams in the college football playoff.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that we don't know how many the SEC gets in or any conference gets in really is what makes this fun. Because if we knew how many they were going to get in, whether it was 4 or 5 or whatever, it would take a lot of the suspense out of it. Because we're all working on the assumption that unless you have just a brutal schedule, an SEC team gets in at 10-2. They probably don't get in at 9-3. Most don't. So if you're just looking at it from that standpoint, you can look in the preseason like we did and say they have 4 ranked teams on their schedule, and if they win 2 of them, they're in. If they only win 1 of them, they're probably out. But they got to run the table the rest of the way. So NC State, Oklahoma, Alabama, Georgia, win 2 of those, and you're in. If you don't lose any others, but that takes the fun out of it. I mean, I think of this as like like the baseball playoffs, Major League Baseball. Like oh, you're out. You're 3 games out. Now you're 2 games out. Now you're 1.5 games out. Now you're back to 3.5 games out. That sort of thing. I think that's the fun of what the playoff could be. And so if you want to do it that way, well, Tennessee in the coaches poll right now is 12th. This week. If they beat NC State, they may be 10th, and you're going to say, hey, they're in. But if they lose to NC State, they're back out until they beat Oklahoma. Now they're back in. So we can be boring and just say they need to go 10-2, get to 10-2, however, and that's one way, but that's not fun. The fun thing is to say whether they're in or out as if it's an NCAA tournament. And so that's the way that fans are going to look at it. But you beat NC State, you're in for now. If you lose that game, you're out for now.
And it does help Tennessee that Oklahoma just absolutely blitzed Temple in its opener. Now, I know Temple's not a great team, won 3 games last year. Probably doesn't mean that much in the grand scheme of things, but it helps Tennessee, I think, if Oklahoma comes into that week 4 clash in Norman with a 3-0 record, because then Oklahoma is going to be a top 15 team, and it's really a chance before the first playoff rankings come out for Tennessee to get a statement win on the road in a true road game, whereas this weekend against NC State, dubbed a neutral site game, that would be a real statement in week 4. But before we get there, let's take a few minutes and look at this game against NC State. This was sort of the, I feel like, overlooked game on Tennessee's schedule in the preseason a little bit. We talked a lot about the Georgia-Alabama games, the Oklahoma game, wondering if there's any other pitfalls in the conference. But this one sort of snuck below the radar. And Adam, you mentioned Grayson McCall, the quarterback for NC State, formerly a star at Coastal Carolina. NC State didn't really look great in its opening win against Western Carolina. Again, I never know how much we should read into those FCS results, but does that change your outlook on this game at all? I mean, for me, it makes me think a little bit like, I thought Tennessee was going to win before. Now I'm even more confident that Tennessee's going to win this game, but I could be just overthinking a pair of FCS results. Where do you guys stand?
I don't put a whole lot of stock in that first game. I mean, they did win it. They have a dangerous player in Casey Concepcion. By the way, that's James Pierce's high school teammate. As a dangerous player that Tennessee's going to have to control. But aside from that, if you look on NC State's offense and NC State's defense, like I always think of NC State as like a pretty good, but not great or not bad ACC team. Like the kind of team that can go 8-4 in the ACC. The kind of team that if they were in the SEC, you would think they'd probably be like a Mississippi State. That's how I see NC State. And after seeing that game against Western Carolina, I feel the same. I don't think they're phenomenal on offense, but they're pretty good. They're not phenomenal on defense, but they're pretty good. So I think my read on it is the same as it was before this week, which is Tennessee will dictate this game whether they win or lose. If they play really well, they're going to win. If they make a lot of mistakes, they're going to lose. I think it depends on how Tennessee plays, not as much how NC State plays.
Yeah, I was a little higher on NC State going into the game, but I agree with Adam. I see it as like maybe a mid-level ACC team that can be pretty good, and that's what it's been in its good years. It's 8-4, but it can't get past that. Well, I saw that team against Western Carolina, watched every play. That's not an 8-4 team. The thing that struck me about it the most was the line play, offensive and defensive. You're playing an FCS opponent in Western Carolina that really held its own against NC State at the line of scrimmage. NC State could not only in the fourth quarter did the Wolfpack really break through. And that to me told me more about the disparity in depth as opposed to the disparity in talent. So I look at before this game, I thought of Tennessee as maybe a 10 to 17 point winner over NC State. And I think Tennessee can win the game by 3 touchdowns now.
Oof. I tell you what's the key to this one is whether or not Tennessee can dictate the tempo. In the game the other day, it was really, really fast. The offense to start that game was faster than it ever was last year. It was as fast as it was back in 2022. And I mean, there's pretty good evidence of that in the press box. The stat crew got about 2 drives behind at one point, and we're having to go back and recalculate. And we asked them about that after the game, and they said, we've been keeping these stats, obviously every game since Josh Heupel's been here, that's the fastest it's ever been, the fastest they've ever had to input the stats. And so if Tennessee can be that fast, there's more of a shock value when you're playing out of conference teams because they haven't seen it. They're not used to it. And even if you prepare for it, NC State has not played that tempo. And so if Tennessee can dictate that, get out, score immediately, James Pierce, put his ears back and get in the backfield, and then you get a turnover or a punt, and then you score again. That's the type of game that Tennessee wants to play. And so it all comes down there to dictate the tempo, get ahead in the first quarter.
John, I really look forward to your post-game column if Nico goes off again. Do you have any more nicknames in the chamber? Is it wait and see? You got a couple things queued up here for week 2?
Well, like I said, that just popped into my head on deadline. You know how that works. Like, it's kind of a hokey thing to do, but, it just popped into my head, and I don't have a lot of time to think about it. So the editor in me doesn't make an appearance, and the writer just kind of has a free rein, whatever it wants to throw out there in the heat of battle there. So, yeah, I'll have to look a little harder at that. But I think NC State lost a lot in its secondary, and it brought in some transfers. And so I'm not real high on NC State's secondary. I think Tennessee could really expose that secondary too.
All right, don't sell yourself short, John. I thought Heismanaleava had a pretty good ring to it. It's easier to read than it is to say. That's the difficult part.
It's much easier to read. Yeah, I couldn't pronounce it. I thought, well, let's see, how would that sound? And I went, no, forget that. Just write it and move on.
All right, key game for Tennessee here in week 2 in a non-conference clash against NC State. You can find all of Adam's coverage leading up to the game and post-game over at KnoxNews.com. John will have the commentary and perhaps a few nicknames as well, and we will be back with you next week to discuss. Thanks for listening to this edition of the Volunteer State.